I welcome Tom Hobby. We will be diving into our part two of changing the narrative on biofuels. And to open it up, we kind of just wanted to start with a question on wood burning and how it's considered a net zero emission process. But with building those plants and other elements of the industry, a lot of other kind of negative externalities can be imposed on the environment, such as habitat damage. And so, what does Yosemite plan to do to mitigate those damages?
Great question, and I think it's on the mind of many people who are concerned about environment, of what real, truly sustainability entails. So I think to kind of paint a picture of a backdrop, we just have to go back to defining what sustainability is and understanding, I guess, on a forestry perspective, how do we get to a sustainable balance between, again, not just locking everything up and making it into a park that has no interactions with humankind, to where we manage ecosystems and work with nature, as we say. So with that, I think it goes back to our preface, I think maybe even in the previous interview, that our forests are dynamic, and because of that, they're always changing. Habitats are changing, the trees are growing, and the challenge has been over the last 100 years that man's impact through our fire suppression, number one, and number two, our forestry practices, is we've really altered the structure and the composition of our forest so that we're not really seeing the same ecosystem types. And so what I'm saying is we've actually changed the habitat types by our own human impacts. And so when we look at what's healthy, in some cases, we have to go back and start a restoration process. And in this case, what we're doing through Yosemite is we're removing some of the basically undesirable trees or overgrowth that needs to go back to what I think a balance is for sustainability. And so in that context, my background is a forest economist. I've worked with some of the global world leaders, and I call it forest sustainable assessments, biometrics, forest fuels, hazard analyses, habitat modeling, all that, so that really, we're not where we were even, 40, 50 years ago. It was very difficult. You'd have some really, some key specialist biologists or habitat people that could kind of identify, species at risk and how the dynamics between the forest and the species interact. But I believe we've really advanced a lot, and that's really been stemmed from the amount of data that we've collected and some of the models that we have now, which are really amazing, frankly. And we're not at the same place that we were 50 years ago, of being uncertain about, number one, how the forests interact with different aspects of our management, but really not only interactions of our management, but the impacts on habitats and sustainability. So what I'm saying is we understand, in this context, that many species have certain habitats that they either prefer or that are desirable. And with the management tools that we have and good data collection, we can actually identify what those standards or those metrics are, and we can manage to those metrics. So there's no real surprise here. It's not rocket science, to be honest. But because of some of our satellite imagery and some of the other type of, remote sensing, we call it in forestry, we're able to do a really good job if we, spend the money to get inventories. We can add all these habitats that are critical for species into that mix. And then for me as a forest economist, if we're planning our bioenergy plants, we can say, hey, look, we can help the environmental groups manage these ecosystems for better habitat. We can increase even old growth, and we can still basically remove this wood that's causing the problem for all our fires and destroying habitat. And I might just add too that some of the folks that don't want to see any impact on habitat, that yes, cutting a tree and putting a skidder out in the forest and building a road, yes, that has an impact. But I will say this, that categorically there's way more, and every landscape is a different number, but there's way more damage that is happening from the wildfires that are at the scale and the severity and intensity that we've seen in particularly the last decade. But because of these fires are so intense and so severe, they're destroying habitat that we would have never seen even from forest practices over the last 100 years. So that's kind of my opening opera, so to speak. But I think we can really step back and say, hey, look, we can work with all the people that are interested in species and habitats. We have a great Environmental Protection Act, and under NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, we can protect the species that really are important. And yes, there are lists that are endangered species or threatened that are always being maintained, so we can make sure we're not missing any species that might be threatened. But from a forest economist perspective, we have the tools in the toolbox, and with good data collection, we can manage for all of that. And so we're not afraid to kind of step into the ring and say, hey, look, let us just give you a realistic plan. It's based on good data, and help us to get the job done so we can better manage our forests. So there you go. There's my 2 cents on the subject.
That was wonderful. And bear with me with this next question, because I think it's a lot of people wonder this, but don't really know how to go about asking it. And that is, when we talk about forest biomass and the sheer amount of it due to improper forest management in past years, eventually with companies like Yosemite Clean, the forest biomass will be better managed and there will be less of it. So how does that translate into using forest biomass? Is that a fuel source that's going to eventually run out, or does it continue to provide within itself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, great question. Well, I know I'll just refer back to a study. It was put out here about 2 years ago from, I believe it was the public policy group out of Berkeley, which did a study on the whole, the headwaters of the Sierra Nevada. And what they did is they took a high level, overview of the forest ingrowth, the species composition, and the mix. And basically it really showed that, our forests are so overgrown. We're sitting on, the last 30 years where we've locked up our forests. Those trees are growing roughly, in general terms, 4 to 5% a year. So really, over 30 years, that forest volume is more than double. It's close to double. So in real terms, we have a problem that we have too much fuel. And yes, we're not going to be able to go out and harvest all of this even in the next 20 years. So if you were to harvest it all in the next 20 years, yeah, that would reduce the supply long term. But we have, tens of millions of tons that we need to remove. And before we ever can get to, getting that first, I call it that bumper, a wave of reducing that forest hazardous fuel, someday we may get to a place where, yeah, because of climate change, we're going to reduce the number of trees per acre. That will reduce the volumes in the future. But I'm thinking, we're probably 50 years out on that. So at least for my lifetime, that's not going to be a problem. But again, with the modeling tools I'm talking about and having real inventory, we'll be able to manage and model all of that. So that's just the position that I'm at. And again, I think for the next 20 years, we're going to have to accelerate the pace and scale, getting our forests back to homeostasis or to equilibrium. And really, that's going to help with our sustainable future. And if we don't do that, we've already burned almost 40% of our national forests in California have burned in the last 10 years. And if we don't swing the pendulum fast, we could see 100% of that, of a burned landscape, even in the next 20 years. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we can't wait, I'll say, not being too flippant, but we can't get everybody to sing Kumbaya on every issue on the environment. But we have to major with the majors. I think we have large, well-known and respected, I call it environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy and others that are really for this forest stewardship to reduce the hazardous fuels, and others that haven't seen the evidence because they still remember the past. I think we just have to demonstrate transparency, authenticity, and when we do our work, we got to tell the story and do a better job of communicating. And that's part of what this series is about, that we want to start that first step on Yosemite Clean, that we want to be a very open and transparent company, and that hasn't always been the case in the past in the forest sector.
So if you began a conversation with someone who wasn't very, experienced with the world of biofuels, and they see it as people coming in, taking biomass out of the forest for an extensive period of time and turning it into a fuel, what would be something that you would say very simply, just to kind of change the narrative on biofuel not being something that's non-renewable, something it's all at once, all encompassing, and then it's gone.
Right. Well, I would just say that, we have very, very strong environmental legislation at the federal and at the state level that really restricts any type of, serious, I call it extraction that's going to leave our forests, like the story of the Lorax. We're not going to end up like Dr. Seuss with no trees left and seeing ecosystem destroyed and no habitat. We're way beyond that. So number one, we've got good environmental laws and good regulatory, procedures. So we have to meet all those guidelines to be able to cut even a stick of wood, number one. Number two, again, it goes back to this topic that forests are dynamic. They're changing, and we can't just let them sit static, because with this, current situation under climate change, a static forest that's not being, managed is a risk to fire. And then seriously, the damage that's happening because of these fires is 10 times that of damage, in my opinion, of what any type of forest activity would be, because we're not just looking at the damage from the smoke and the loss of trees. The soils are severely being damaged, where they won't grow a tree because they're so hot that actually the soil silica becomes like glass and it's impenetrable. It's hydrophobic. So I guess what I'm saying is, without some kind of level of removing this wood that's small diameter and using it, to make some kind of economic driver to do this stewardship, we would be looking at billions of dollars of subsidies, burdening the taxpayers. And frankly, we don't have to do that. We have an economic solution through Yosemite Clean and biofuels. But so people are put at ease. We've got good environmental legislation. We have good modeling, and really the science is out there. The damage from these wildfires to not just the habitat for animals, but the soils, the watersheds, on top of that, all the air particulates. It's just really the right thing to do on every front. So I think once people see this, and if anybody's lived in California and lived through the last 5 years of smoke, and then driven around our Sierras and seeing the damage afterwards, or the flooding, the erosion, and then all the brush. Like I just drove to Yosemite with our Austrian friends last weekend, and they saw the rim fire, which was in 2013, and that was really the aha moment in California on the topic of fire severity, where about a third of that forest was decimated, where it can't grow a tree, and people realize, oh, we just let it go too far. So I think collectively, when people that are concerned about the environment really, don't just listen to a 30-second soundbite, but get into the facts, look at the science, hear our story as a company and what we're really, hey, this is the place where I grew up and loved and worked and played, and I want to leave it better for my children and future generations. And people are going to need to trust that at some fundamental level, and our job is to help them to earn that trust in the public eye. And so that's our hope as a company, and really part of the passion behind me as a forest economist, and why Yosemite Clean really is kind of a catalyst, I think, in this whole forest sustainability. Because right now we're not seeing any way to get these forests back into kind of equilibrium, and I believe Yosemite is a part of the solution.
You mentioned soils and the damage that wildfires have on it and its ability to grow trees. And is that damage irreversible, or is it something that can be kind of fixed over time and those damages alleviated and trees being able to grow again?
Yeah, the question about soils being damaged and is it irreversible? The answer to that is no, it's not irreversible, but it's very long and drawn out, potentially even centuries. And really, it almost needs a physical, turning over the soil to kind of get through this layer that's been kind of cooked, to be able to get water to penetrate again. So the problem is, we've turned our forest into almost like parking lots that are paved. The water's running off. It's not percolating down into the soil structure. So those plants and trees really don't have a chance to have enough water to survive. And that's creating a huge mess. Like I said, I took our Austrian engineer friends up to Yosemite last week through Tuolumne County, through the rim fire, which is back in 2013. And we stopped at the lookout, looking over the rim fire, which goes out to Cherry Valley and over the Tuolumne River. And you can just see tens of thousands of acres of nothing but brush coming back. And my Austrian friends were just shocked. It's like, well, why hasn't anything been done? Well, our federal government has only treated maybe about 10% of that forest has had any type of cleanup, and really very few trees have been planted. And about a third of that whole landscape, they've done this, the fire severity maps that where they know that this soil is severely damaged. So, without some way to intervene and, I call it get ahead of the fire curve, we're going to start seeing, tens of thousands of acres each year, permanently damaged for centuries and generations. And that's not acceptable. We can do a way better job. And it goes back to the purpose of why we're here at Yosemite Clean is work with nature, work with communities and Forest Service and fire safe councils, that as we begin to manage our forest sustainably, that fire won't be a severe and intense fire. We can drop it from a crown fire to the ground, and a light burn is actually healthy for the forest. So don't get me wrong, fire is, it's a tool, and it's a healthy tool when managed properly at the right level of intensity and severity. So that's the point, is that we've just let fire get out of the bounds of a healthy norm, and we got to get it back to where fire can be the tool in the toolbox versus fire being the elephant in the room.
So there's a lot of skepticism regarding the claim that biomass source energy has a net zero carbon emission, because many operations achieve that net zero because they replant trees which are intended to sequester the carbon emitted by their plant. However, tree succession periods are long term and they would not sequester carbon right away. So how does Yosemite Clean respond to these issues and kind of act as a solution to these biomass energy processes?
Again, great question. And yes, I call it the carbon cycle, and the life cycle is long term. So, if you plant a tree, the carbon that's immediately removed and then replaced does take time to regenerate into the overall carbon balance. But I would add, there's a couple of big things here. One is the amount of carbon emitted by our wildfires trumps all of transportation and industry in California. The last 2 years, it's been fact. The Air Board's finally gotten honest about this and said, hey, even though global carbon accounting does not include wildfires, it's the elephant in the room. And if you don't include fire, all the rest of the stuff about decarbonizing is really just greenwashing. I'll just say it straight out. We have to manage fire, number one. Number two is if we let these fires, after they've been burned, all these trees, fall down, and then they actually decompose and create methane. And methane is 20 times the impact of carbon dioxide. Methane emissions in the greenhouse gas, as a greenhouse gas, has a factor of 20x. So if we don't use this wood and bring it in and plant trees, the damage just around the carbon cycle is, it's going to create way more methane. And we're seeing that even places around the world where global warming is happening, particularly like on the Arctic, or even the area around the Arctic has a lot of peat and soils that are basically full of rich of carbon, that now when they get hot, they're emitting all this methane. And so the amount of methane being emitted already on the planet naturally is unbelievable. It's growing exponentially. And if we don't take and clean up after these fires, we're going to see the same thing. We're going to see all this decomposition of bug-killed trees and fire-killed trees. We're never going to get our climate targets for reducing carbon to the 1.5 Celsius or 2 if we don't include these in the accounting. So I don't like fuzzy math. I like to be straight with real numbers. We've got to put fire in the mix on the accounting, and we can do the best job is using it for biofuels, bar none. And yes, it'll take us, some places in California, the timber rotation is about 60 years. Yeah, it may take us 30, 40 years to really get the benefit of those trees replanted, but it's these other offsets of avoiding emissions from methane production and avoiding emissions for the smoke and particulates and CO2 release on fires. It's really the holistic, sum of the pieces, not just one part. So, while some people might say, hey, we're not getting this carbon sink for 20, 30 years out, all these other benefits add up. And, I think the math is we've got way more benefits than liabilities here.
Well, that was beautiful. I don't see any better way to end our changing the narrative. Is there anything else that you would want to add on before I really want to respect your time. I know we're coming up on half an hour here.
No, that's been great. Fun to add a little bit more to the narrative and keep the communications rolling. It's been a fun series. So I appreciate the great questions and thoughtfulness, and hope this can get us more people on board to see what the value is for what we're doing and believe in our company fundamentally, not, just not another group here trying to take wood and, what do you call it? Smoke and mirrors for forestry, and there's been a lot of bad forest narrative. They just kind of put their head down and, didn't really respect people to listen to people's concerns and give them really articulate, evidence-based science answers. And we're going to change that, Yosemite. We're going to do it because we're going to rock this thing.
We sure are.
Yeah. All right.